Hey everybody, a video here for you today, and I was going to put this in with a Q&A video that I'm working on. Maybe we'll upload closer to the weekend, but this is just a follow-up on my last video on Sogmatar. I think that is how you pronounce it. But here is another pic, and this is Ancient Pages, and I will leave the link below. But here you can see part of the structure that is now buried at Sogmatar. But here is that pic blown up a little bit. I know this is a little fuzzy, but you can see a little more of the man-made work here and a little more of the structure than exists today. So this pic must have been taken back in time a little. And any guesses to what's under here and how old it is just pure speculation. Now I use this website about, I think, over a year ago on a video I made here, mainly on this subject. This is a child's toy that is 5,000 years old. This goes back to about 3000 BC, which would really be about the first dynasty around there of the Egyptians. And they already had culture with symbolism, child's toys. This place must have been flourishing 5,000 years ago. How far back does this place go? Now, when I looked into Sogmatar, the things that really interested me were these reliefs here and the Syriac inscriptions and what this really means here. And this is really lost history. But this goes back to 5 years of research I've done. And when I say 5 years of research, I mean I didn't read for 5 straight years, but this was like my default thing. If I wanted to look into something and I really didn't have anything specific, I would always go back to what we know as the Shroud of Turin and that mystery. And that's something that I never thought I would look into or even cared about. The New Testament and the biblical stuff, when I got into ancient mysteries, that was something I wasn't going to touch. A lot of people had their own theory on the symbolism of Christ, where that story came from. This seems to be a pro-Roman tale that was written about 275 years, finalized 275 years after whatever happened that sparked this initial story. But Sogmatar, it seems there are a lot of different periods of history. People came in here and built tombs and honored their gods, had a place that was always sacred. The history goes back at least 5,000 years. How far back does that really go at Sogmatar? Well, that is a good question to ask. Now, from nearby Edessa, which is today known as Sanliurfa, the Abgar dynasty in the early centuries was thriving, and they were here, and they cut this in here. And this is really where the whole story begins. Even in the Bible, they say Christians were first called Christians at Antioch, and there were many Antiochs, and that just simply means city of Antiochus. Names that got attached to people and places were very descriptive back then. Antioch simply meant city of Antiochus. There was many of them, but all researchers who research this time period say that comes from Edessa, Turkey. And if you've listened to Ralph Ellis, his 30 years of research on where this whole story began, it's all centered on Edessa, Turkey. And I read Ralph Ellis and listened to him talk, and that really changed the whole way how I thought about biblical text was written. But it's a super complicated thing to look into. I never wanted to. And then I came across a story on the Knights Templar, and it seems they for sure had what we know today as the Shroud of Turin back 1,500 years ago, 1,200 years ago. It's not called the Shroud of Turin, and the whole history gets lost. And all research on the Shroud of Turin begins, is this indeed the burial cloth of Christ, or is this indeed a medieval hoax? They give you two possibilities, a terrible way to do research. What is this above the head here? Is this symbolic? Does it actually represent something in the real world? What is this? Well, they tell us, and it's directly connected to the Shroud of Turin. Now, before I go into what this is here, maybe some of you have said it, but I want to go into this little figure here, carved with the head cocked a little to the left. Maybe some of you have seen this on TV. I have had a lot of questions on Oak Island. What do I think? Well, I think the Templars knew the story. They knew the story, and they knew everything about it. Are they on to the right story on this TV show with the Templars? Yes. Do they know where this stuff comes from? I don't think so. And they're going to be talking about this cross, the small cross they found on the TV show, and they have talked about this. Well, now in my future video, The Templars Lost or Last Crusade, I'm not sure of the title yet, I'm going to be showing the huge stone crosses, head tilted to the left, the real story of the Templars here in Nova Scotia. Now what does this represent above the head here? Here it is shown. What does this represent? Well, they tell us in text, probably the first text written about this perceived miracle by these people. This represents a pearl. Now this is the Gnostic website, and this was known also as the Hymn of the Robe of Glory or Hymn of the Soul, but the original name was the Hymn of the Pearl. This is found in the Acts of Thomas, and you may think, the Acts of Thomas, what is that? People are kind of familiar with the Gospel of Thomas, this Gnostic text, apocryphal text that was found near Nag Hammadi in Egypt. I have read the Acts of Thomas, the Apocalypse of Thomas, the Infancy of Thomas, and everything about Thomas, because Thomas isn't about Thomas, it's about the twin. Here it says, it is ultimately derived from the Aramaic personal name, and it's Thoma or Toma, meaning twin. That's where Thomas derives from, the twin. And when reading about Thomas, you have to take this into consideration. The story's narrator is the soul, and it's told from the perspective of the twin. Well, this can only mean the shroud is rooted in the origin of Thomas. And I'd like to throw this in, by the way, when I first heard about the shroud or saw the shroud and had some initial impressions, well, I thought it was a medieval hoax. And then I looked into it and I realized that it could not be a medieval hoax. The dating was done terribly wrong in the worst way possible, and I will leave a link below. But this is an actual 2,000-year-old relic. But the story of who this is has just been totally lost to history. But if you read on in this story, and I will leave the text below, but there are clues, big clues. This is where the story originates. The purple mantle, of course, we know what color the Christ figure was wearing. It talks about a journey down to Egypt. The serpent is invoked. But the soul is talking here. I forgot that I was a king's son. The author of this, where does he come from? Well, the court of Edessa. Talks about the kings and chieftains of Parthia. And here it says, bethink thyself of the pearl for which thou didst journey to Egypt. The language of the shroud is always symbolic. Here it says, remember thy glorious robe, thy splendid mantle remember. Put on and wear as an adornment when thy name may be read in the book of heroes. And towards the end it gets really descriptive, and we can tie it into the Shroud of Turin for sure. Here the soul is talking, or Thomas, as he became known as. At once, as soon as I saw it, the glory looked like my own self. I saw in it all of me, and saw me all in of it. That we were twain in distinction, and yet again one in likeness. Were twain of one likeness, for one sign of the king was upon them. And the word twain later gets put into one of the most important passages in the New Testament. And here a description of the glorious robe, or the linen. The King of Kings image was depicted entirely all over it, and that perfectly describes the Shroud of Turin. And then it says, I saw that moreover, all over it, the motions of Gnosis abounding. The secret knowledge, the Gnosis, the secret knowledge of where this original text comes from, that's been a mystery. Well, they tell you it's because the King of Kings image was depicted entirely all over it. Those were the original motions of Gnosis and led to the Gnostic text, the Shroud of Turin. And then this motions of Gnosis, it goes into this. And with its kingly motions, it was pouring itself out towards me. Now the language, the original language of the shroud is very symbolic. Words are tied into it. It says pouring itself out towards me. And water is one of the words symbolically tied into the shroud. Light, the standing one, the bridal chamber, the rose especially. The rose is the vessel of the soul. That is so important. And in my shroud video coming up, I will be talking about the rose and everything connected to it. It says, "For he had received me with gladness," and that is King Abgar. And the first thing we hear about an image, it's given to King Abgar, and it heals him. Abgar dynasty from Edessa was at Sogmatar. They carved this symbolism in the rock. We know that the hymn of the pearl comes from Edessa, Turkey. Here it says the earliest liturgical clue may well be the hymn of the soul, or the pearl, which was written in the vicinity of Edessa and can be found in the Acts of Thomas. It says the earliest documents we have on Edessan Christianity, namely the Gospel of Thomas, the song or hymn of the pearl contained in the Acts of Thomas, and the Odes of Solomon, go back in part to the end of the 1st century. But I just thought I would make this video. I know there's a lot of interest on the age and what is actually at Sogmatar. That seems to be a very unknown, unexcavated place. Hopefully further research will come out of it. What really fascinated me were these reliefs here. I can tie them into stories I have been working on. I haven't talked about Oak Island for about 3 or 4 years. Well, you people doing that series, you better wrap it up before you get scooped by a dude on his couch. My final wrap-up video on the Shroud of Turin will be coming up, I would say, in the next 6 weeks. Hope you thought this video was interesting, and you all have a very nice day.